Tequila Jalisco in Rojeña. It's the eldest distillery of tequila in Mexico. It's been producing since 1795. And basically here is where we've received the agave, the Azul Tequilana Weber. And from a generic standpoint, basically what we do is we cook the piñas, then we extract the carbohydrates or the juice. Then comes the fermentation process, distillation process, and the last, probably not least, more important, is the maturation process. Let's talk about the first step of the tequila elaboration, which is the cooking process. Again, what we're looking for is to convert complex sugars into simple sugars so they could all be fermentable later on in the process. Everything starts in the cooking step. Here in Cuervo we use stone ovens made out of a local rock and basically cement, and that is a very important piece on the aroma and the creation of all the sensory factors. So really what happens is we load the ovens with agave. We cooked, which is every tequila house has its own personal recipes. We have multiple recipes. We cooked at least the agave for 36 hours. We use steam to do that. We reach about 95 to 96 degrees Celsius inside that oven, and we cooked at atmospheric temperature. So the next step is really a mechanical step. We call it molienda or milling. It's really what we want to extract all of those sugars from the agave fiber. So that's really the purpose of it. Mechanically extract those sugars. That later on would be the next step, would be fermentation. So if we talk about milling, there's multiple alternatives in the milling process. The fermentation is key for the end sensory profile you're expecting. So what is it that we're looking into fermentation? As we've said, after milling, we have our concentrated juice of sugar agave, which we call it mosto or mash. Let's call it mash. So really what we're looking in fermentation is there's a microorganism that works for us really, that we have to treat very good. It's a yeast. The yeast really what does is, and it's the way of surviving, they do it because otherwise they would die. So they consume fermentable sugars, very simple sugars, and they really, the end product would be alcohol and CO2. That's really what the yeast does. Eats sugar and releases CO2 and produces alcohol. In this case, because we're using agave, the end product is tequila. As you can imagine, there's yeast all over the environment. That's called wild yeast. But this industry and others have found that in order to standardize our sensory profile, we have to use always a standard yeast profile. That is why we have our proprietary yeast. No, it's a yeast that we have separated from environment, and we know it gives and delivers the profiles that we want in the end product. So having said that, we have our proprietary yeast, we have our mash that is put into a tank. Again, like in other processes, time is very important, the yeast important, and in this case in particular, the temperature control is very important. The yeast, it only works and produces alcohol and CO2 at a certain temperature. If it's very low, the activity is very low. If it's very high, you will kill the yeast. So here in Jose Cuervo, we have found that the geometry of our tanks, the concentration of our mash, the type of our uses, and the time that we use for fermentation, it's key for the compounds we want to generate. Because the yeast produces alcohol, or different types of alcohol, and we have other compounds in the fermentation. We produce esters, aldehydes, and those different compounds are the ones that are giving all of the complexity to the product. We don't only want alcohol. This is not a bioethanol plant. We want a profile of a spirit. That is why the yeast has got to be very efficient, but it's got to be chosen to deliver those aromas. We don't want just alcohol, otherwise it would be a vodka. We want to create an experience. So in a summary, what is key for fermentation? As I said before, the microbiology is really who's working. So we want the cleanness of the tanks, of all the environment it's important. The selection of the yeast, how we grow the yeast, how we feed the yeast. The yeast needs a special food, some of the key elements to grow. We need to have always a clean mash, always in a very similar concentration. So if we give those conditions, temperature controls, if we give those conditions to our yeast, the yeast will work like a Swiss watch. And that is really what we want to do here in Jose Cuervo. Really what the distillation does is to separate the compounds that we really want in our end product. It's really like in an orchestra, is the guy who's leading all of the different instruments. Everything that we have created in cooking, and especially in fermentation, the distillation process is the one that's going to be making the jigsaw puzzle for the end. So what happens is we put that low beer into the first still. We use pot stills. The geometry and the size is very important because this, as the other process or any art in cooking, the speed of the reactions are critical for the efficiency of the process or for the sensory profile that we're looking for. We've loaded the first pot still that it's called stripper, destrozador in Spanish. So once it's loaded, we start injecting steam. It's indirect steam. It goes through a coil. So what happens when we start boiling that wine? If you remember chemistry, depending on the compounds, they have a molecular weight, they're heavier, lighter compounds, and they start evaporating at different temperatures. So really the name of the game is we boil that juice, and because of the boiling points of the different compounds, we start separating the compounds to acquire what we really are looking for. In the distillation terminology, basically the first compounds that start evaporating are called heads. Why? Because are the upper part of a body. If you can make the relation, those would be light molecules, light compounds in weight. Those are not desirable products. Those are, even from a visual standpoint, they are whitish, turbid liquid that is really pushing some of the fatty oils and some of the non-desirable compounds. Those are the heads. Then really the outcome of the first distillation here with us, it's called ordinario. Ordinario, it's where we separate a compound of those, comes from the agave beer, from the low beer, and is where we know we have all of the compounds that we are looking for, the different types of alcohols, the different types of esters, the different types of aldehydes, because that's where we're looking for all the fruital notes, the floral notes, and of course the agave notes. And the rest, so we start playing, when we start distilling, the heads comes out, we dismiss them, ordinario starts coming out, we save that, and then the last part is the tails, which are the heavy molecules that are not desirable as well. So that ordinario, once we have finished the first distillation process in the stripper, what we do is the ordinario is feed into the second still, that is called the rectifier, rectificador in Spanish. So really what we're doing there is a final I would say, separation of the desirable compounds. Again, the second distillation we have heads, light compounds that we don't want. We have the tequila, and then we have the tails. Usually we have found that the best proof for extraction, in our case, in the Mexican conditions of humidity, of temperature, of altitude, the composition of the tequila and the wood that I'll try to explain, we have learned that the best proof of loading the barrels with tequila is between 55% alcohol by volume to 65% alcohol by volume. That range is the optimal that we have found. If we load those barrels at a higher proof, we have found that it's not just a reaction of extraction of all the different compounds that we want to get from the wood. We want to have a lot of reaction inside the barrel. So we have found that between that alcohol content is where we have observed the best extraction and reaction in the barrels. So it's important. The first compound is the type of tequila you put into the barrels, because if we talk about the next level in the tequila norm, we have white tequilas, then we have what the next category is called joven, which stands for, it's a combination of white tequila and a blend of a mature tequila, so that's a joven. Then the third category would be a reposado. That means that the tequila, or 100% agave tequila, would need to be in contact with wood for at least 2 months. The fourth category, it's called an añejo tequila. That means that the contact of tequila with wooden barrels needs to be at least for 1 year. So if we have a tequila with 361 days, it would be a reposado. It could only be called an añejo if it's 265 days plus 1. And the last but not least category is an extra añejo. It needs to be in the barrel for at least 3 years. So if you have a tequila in barrels for 2 years, 361 days, it's an añejo. It's not an extra añejo yet. So, having said that, we take a lot of care of the white tequila that needs to go into the barrel, just like the agave coming into the distillery needs to be the best. The tequila that goes into the barrel needs to be the best. Otherwise, the barrels would not eliminate any errors in the spirit. So what we're looking for in a barrel, we always in Jose Cuervo, we start with new barrels. We use different types of woods, American oak, French oak, or Eastern European oak. And those barrels, we treat them differently depending on what type of flavors or emotions or aromas we're looking for. In order for a barrel to work, it needs to be heat treated. And it could be either char with direct fire or toasted. And there's also differences in the depth of the char or the depth of the toast. So in the market you can have different types of charring profiles and different types of toasting profiles, plus different types of oak. American oak, French oak, Eastern European oak. So between that combination, the master blender is really who's playing with those variables to come out with the best blend. So here we need to be very patient because we need to control the maturation warehouse to try to give the tequila a good rest. And even though we try to control the temperature, the humidity, to of course keep as much as we can the tequila into the barrels. We do have some evaporation that is called angel share, and that is really common and is really necessary. Why do we have angel share? Because the porosity of the wood is very important. You can probably go to some distilleries and you can see barrels that they are painted. So that's just a wooden tank. In order to have angel share and really a reaction is why the wood needs to be natural wood, and because there's oxygen exchange with the barrel. It's the reason why oxygen comes in, there's a reaction in the barrel, and alcohol comes out. It's the reason why every time you go into a maturation warehouse, you smell those angel shares.